Our following speaker has over 25 years of experience in the cybersecurity realm and intelligence experience working for the U.S. Department of Defense and the private sector. He'll be speaking about evolving modern tradecraft, how ChatGPT and AI are being leveraged in nation-state and e-crime cyber attacks. Please welcome Scott Jarkoff, Director, Intelligence Strategy, APG, and Meta, CrowdStrike.
Thank you very much. All right. Good. I guess it's still officially good morning. I was actually preparing to say good afternoon, but good morning. As you heard, my name is Scott. I'm with CrowdStrike, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of adversary use of things like ChatGPT and this new emerging area of technology that we all call generative AI. I think everyone's interested in AI, and so let's just jump right in. So just real quick about me. So you know my name. Spent about 25 years working for the US government, focusing on security and intelligence. And then I did a little stint with, I don't know, like a startup. I'll let you guys do a little bit of open source intelligence to figure out what that means. And I've been with CrowdStrike now for just about 5 years and looking after the APJ and the Middle East regions. This is what we're going to go over for the next, I guess, 20 minutes or so, give or take. And we're going to focus on kind of just some threats in the beginning, move into what is generative AI, talk about adversary usage of it, and then we'll take it home from there. We'll land the plane at that point. All right, just one thing that I always start my presentations with is this mantra of no longer being focused on malware, but instead taking a broader look and being focused on adversaries. And this is important especially as we talk about the use of generative AI, because you're not going to just be focusing on a single piece of tooling. This is going to be adversaries, very distinct groups using generative AI in very specific manners. So I think this notion of you no longer have a malware problem, you have an adversary problem, plays very well with the topic that we're going to be talking about today. All right, so introduction. I want to start with just setting the stage on the types of adversaries that we're really talking about today. And we're really talking about adversaries that have a nexus to a government, aka nation-state adversaries. Contrast that with adversaries whose entire goal in life is to generate some kind of financial reward, otherwise known as ECrime adversaries. And then adversaries who are trying to spread some kind of political and/or ideological message. So hacktivists or activists. For the idea of generative AI, I'm not going to discount that hacktivists won't use it in some way, shape, or form. Certainly they will, but generally we're going to focus primarily on the nation-state and e-crime usage of generative AI. And we're going to even talk kind of a little bit broad, take a step back, and even talk about just AI in general. So with that, let's talk about a few attack trends globally before we actually get into the use of generative AI, because this kind of sets the stage for the types of attacks that we're seeing and where potentially there will be a nexus between these types of attacks and the actual use of generative AI in those attacks. So high-profile e-crime attacks, these are attacks that are happening all over the globe. I mean, we're all reading about ransomware each and every day. It happens everywhere. And then the move from ransomware to extortion, meaning adversaries no longer necessarily need to drop ransomware in order to effect some kind of payment. It's just stealing data, threatening the victim, and then ideally, at least from the adversary perspective, ideally then they're able to get paid. That's definitely not the ideal outcome, don't get me wrong, but that happens, right? We're seeing a lot of adversaries moving away from malware and using native operating system tooling. There's also adversaries that are very, very focused on vulnerability exploitation, adversaries that are doing primarily intellectual property theft or some form of espionage. And then the final piece of this puzzle would be adversaries that are very focused on cloud-based attacks. So with that as kind of our backdrop, let's talk about some of the sophistication. So 2019, this number that I'm going to talk about, in 2019 it was 582 minutes. 582 minutes. A mere 2 years later, this dropped to 98 minutes. And then another 2 years, so far this year, this number, what we call breakout time, is actually 79 minutes. Breakout time is the time that it takes an adversary to gain initial access and then to conduct that first lateral movement. So from initial access to lateral movement, in 2023, the average ECrime breakout time is 79 minutes. So in 4 years, ECrime adversaries went from 582 minutes to 79. And the fastest breakout time that we've seen in 2023 is 7 minutes. So ECrime adversaries are sophisticated. And when we start talking about AI and generative AI, we cannot discount ECrime adversaries from this conversation because they are highly sophisticated and taking a lot of cues from their nation-state counterparts. All right, let's talk a little bit about generative AI, or actually we'll start with AI just in general. Like, AI has been something that I guess we all have been scared of AI, right? Like, there's artificial intelligence in all kinds of movies. It's like a big thing in pop culture. I mean, Arnold Schwarzenegger in The Terminator, I'm probably dating myself by talking about The Terminator. It's, very old and, pretty famous piece of pop culture. And, there's all the robots that were in the movie. And then I think there's a line in the movie around, the system goes online, August 4th, 1997. So we're talking, many years ago. And then Skynet, which is the name of this system, becomes self-aware. And then that's like the entire basis for the movie, right? So the robots take over because of artificial intelligence. And then similarly, I'm sure, some of us are familiar with The Matrix, and it's not too dissimilar. Like, there was a conversation with two of the quote-unquote good guys in the movie where they talk about how humanity marveled at creating artificial intelligence. And then this singular consciousness just somehow ended up turning on humanity, and then that, again, kind of forms the basis for the actual theme of the movie, where it's humans versus artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence has been in pop culture for a long time. I just named 2 movies, but there's tons of movies that have been built on the basis or developed on the basis of artificial intelligence. But at the end of the day, what is generative AI? I think we all have an idea of what artificial intelligence is, but what is generative AI? And I'm sure most of us are aware of ChatGPT. I mean, how many of us are actually using ChatGPT? Anyone actually played with ChatGPT? Right? So yeah, there's a number of hands, right? And so, ChatGPT is of the textual type of generative AI, right? Where you can train it using text, teach it, and then ask it questions, ask it to produce different types of output, but it's all text-based, right? And then you have other types of tooling, such as, I think it's DALL-E, which is also by OpenAI, same makers as ChatGPT, which is focused on creating images. And then there's other tools that will help you create actual moving media, right? So generative AI is designed, or is a tool designed for creation of some type of image, text, or media. I talked about ChatGPT, I talked about DALL-E, but here are just some additional examples of the different types of tools that are out there, right? I know, like for me in particular, me and my friends, we like to just play around and use Midjourney quite often for creating just different images. Sometimes we've played around with Stable Diffusion, which is an open source one that anyone can download and start doing their own things with. So that's kind of like the background of artificial intelligence and generative AI. Not a whole lot really there, because I think we're all pretty well aware of these tools. They're in the media, we've heard about them, we've played with them, we know what they do. But now, what about the bad guys? What about the bad guys using artificial intelligence? Are they actually using artificial intelligence? Are they using generative artificial intelligence? I think this is the big question on everyone's mind, right? Are adversaries in fact using this? So what are some of the ways that you can use generative AI in kind of a malicious capacity? Well, I mean, there's a number of different ways, and probably one of the easy ways, or the easy quote-unquote wins, in particular on the ECrime side of the house. And I mentioned ECrime because I talked about that breakout time earlier. But on the ECrime side of the house, there's a lot of very inexperienced or very low-level criminals who are trying to capitalize on purchasing malware on the dark web and purchasing playbooks off of the dark web, and then trying to generate some kind of financial reward. But they're not really all that sophisticated. They're low-level criminals. They don't know a lot. They don't have a lot of expertise. So what's a quick way to build some pretty effective tooling? Well, using something like ChatGPT to generate code. And we've seen situations where adversaries or criminal groups are in fact doing just that. They are not sophisticated, and they're just training, ChatGPT as one example, training ChatGPT to basically develop and produce malicious Python code that could be used as part of an attack. So number one, now you don't necessarily need to be an experienced programmer to develop malicious tooling, but also the amount of time it takes to develop the program has decreased significantly. Where previously it may take, I have kind of a programming background, so not much in the terms of like software development, but maybe previously it took weeks to develop a piece of tooling, whereas now you can get a head start using ChatGPT, for example, and then develop an entire piece of malware in maybe just a few days as opposed to a couple weeks. So speeding up that process. Social engineering is another easy one. It's much easier to develop far more authentic sounding lures for your social engineering targets, and same thing with phishing as well. It's really easy to build very complex yet authentic sounding lures using generative AI. And you can combine both like textual generative AI along with image-based, and put together a pretty effective campaign that sounds exceedingly authentic. A lot of the lures that we see now, and like in particular, if we're talking about lures in like a native language, they probably weren't developed by somebody that speaks that language natively. So we're able to see that there's issues with the actual use of the language. Well, now that kind of idiosyncrasy may be able to go away, and it'll actually even sound far more believable. The idea of using generative AI for information warfare or information operations and around propaganda spreading, and just think of everything that's going on in the world today, where you could potentially create different information operations campaigns quite easily through the use of generative AI, and that's happening and will probably continue to happen and will probably continue to evolve, throughout the years. And then there's a new piece of tooling or a new piece of an attack that's called a prompt attack. This is where you can actually, as an adversary, when you're training, say, like the large language models that are used by the generative AIs, you can basically use the prompts where you're asking the questions or where you're feeding it information to basically jailbreak the environment and then get that piece of generative AI to do something that it's designed not to do. So, start developing, maybe asking it to develop tools that go around the guardrails or are outside of the guardrails that are put in place. So these are just some of the prominent threats that we're seeing, each and every day. If we talk about like specific adversary usage of generative AI, I'd say probably China is the most prevalent in this area. They are stealing vast amounts of data from all over the globe, and they have extremely sophisticated tradecraft. They're very good at what they do. They've been doing it for a very, very long time. And if you think about the amount of time that they've been doing this, I've been in cyber for, I guess I shouldn't admit this on stage, but I've been in cyber since the 90s, at the very beginning when cyber was nascent. And, we were dealing with Chinese-based adversaries all the way back then. And, if you think about the amount of time that's elapsed since China has evolved into basically an espionage powerhouse on the cyber front, the amount of data that they have, not necessarily generative AI is an important thing for them yet, but artificial intelligence in order to distill that data down into something that is coherent and being able to understand and find patterns in the data that they've stolen is, probably pretty amazing and exceedingly helpful, right? Will help them be, probably much better at what they do at the end of the day. Interestingly, the Chinese government's just recently enacted some policies around their own domestic usage of generative AI very specifically, kind of just, balancing the needs of the government with the needs of industry. But there's a number of rules that need to be adhered to if you're going to provide domestic generative AI services within China. So things like ChatGPT and whatnot are just not being used in the country because of these rules. And there's currently, in fact, no ChatGPT-like tooling that's actually authorized for use within China. Probably one of the main threat actors that would be likely to leverage this type of tooling would be an actor that we call Aquatic Panda. This is an adversary that's very focused on stealing vast amounts of data and would need something like artificial intelligence, not necessarily generative AI, but definitely artificial intelligence in order to distill the data that they're stealing down into, as I said earlier, something coherent. When we're talking about the actual real, probably daily use of generative AI, it's really going to be adopted by the ECrime adversaries. I talked about low-level criminals adopting it to speed up development of tooling, such as malware, for the use in their campaigns, but also the lures that I talked about earlier as well. The ECrime adversaries oftentimes are on the precipice or at the very beginning of different types of world events and whatnot. So think about back to the beginning of COVID in 2020. At the very beginning, it was the ECrime adversaries that rapidly adopted this as a talk track, as a lure to get people to click on links that could potentially do things that they shouldn't do. So the ECrime adversaries are using this because they're generally adopters of new technology, But that poor use of language that I talked about earlier, generative AI can actually get rid of that and make these lures, as I said earlier, sound far more authentic. And we're actually, there's no way to know with 100% certainty whether a lure was developed by, an AI or not, but generally speaking, we're starting to, be in a situation where we're seeing more of these lures being, a bit more authentic, and therefore, just at this point, through analysis, making some assumptions, but I think they're, pretty well-grounded assumptions at the end of the day. It's just, the combination of the lures being more authentic, a little bit more attractive, and then coupled with seeing, far more low-level criminals getting involved in operations nowadays that earlier they weren't getting involved in because of that, lack of sophistication and lack of ability to develop tooling that would, at the end of the day, help them achieve their goals. All right, so time to land the airplane. All right. This really, I think, is probably, the main message at this point. I think we are in the very early stages still of generative AI. Artificial intelligence in and of itself, along with machine learning, definitely not early. There's tons of companies out there using artificial intelligence and machine learning, but generative AI and its use in offensive cyber operations is still very nascent. It's still very early days, and it's going to take some time to materialize before we start to see it being used in attacks on a more frequent basis, number one, but more importantly, before we start to see it being used by nation states. Because as I said, there's a very strong likelihood that ECrime adversaries are already leveraging this technology. But nation states, a little bit more cautious, and they're not just going to go out and start using tools like ChatGPT. It's got to be homegrown, it's got to be something that they train, and it's got to be completely segregated from a commercial-based environment in order for a nation state to adopt that type of technology. But having said that, we talked about the bad guy use or the adversary usage of generative AI. What about the defenders? Certainly a lot of us in the audience today are defenders and want to know how we could potentially use generative AI to help defend our networks. And so there's a number of ways. Think about being able to have a generative AI that can tell you what your threat landscape is with just a simple ask of a question, and telling the generative AI that you work in, a particular geography and a particular industry, and then that generative AI can tell you very specifically what are the threats that you need to be concerned with. This also can help with more effective threat hunting because the generative AI can see things that the human eye can't see, and will be able to produce, recommendations that can help with looking for patterns in that data that maybe a human wouldn't have thought to consider. Obviously, enhanced vulnerability scanning. I think this is a pretty obvious use of generative AI to help with, I said the threat landscape piece, and this is also kind of an extension of that, helping with, identifying the vulnerabilities that probably are of the most concern. But there's not just adversary usage of generative AI, there's a number of tools being built by industry to help solve the problem that we all face with, data overload, et cetera, et cetera. So, at the end of the day, I'd say if I made one recommendation, I'd say, read about the adversaries and their use and keep track of the usage of this type of nascent technology through threat intelligence. Certainly, reading about it on the news is one thing, but you want solid analytical understanding of adversary behavior and their usage of tools like generative AI. So with that, I will leave you with this one final note, because I think this is, at the end of the day, what it's all about. And, if I were to sum up these, 12 words, it really comes down to the more you know, the better position that you'll be in. So with that, thank you for your time today, and I hope you found this valuable. Thank you so very much.